The air was thick, not with the typical league-side humidity, but with a dry, electric tension that seemed to hum through the wires of the city's telegraph lines. For 3 weeks, Chicago had been an oven, baking under a relentless drought. The summer had bled into an autumn that offered no relief, leaving the sprawling, rapidly built metropolis, a city of audacious dreams and cheap wooden construction, parched and vulnerable. Joseph Medill smoothed the lapels of his black coat, the wool feeling prickly against his neck. He stood at the mammoth granite pedestal of the new Chicago Tribune building, gazing up at the 4-story structure. It was a declaration, this building, a middle finger to the old guard and the corrupt city officials he relentlessly skewered on the editorial page. "A temple of truth," he muttered, adjusting his spectacles. Medill, a man whose ambition was as sharp as his pen, had arrived in Chicago nearly 2 decades prior and transformed a failing paper into the city's moral conscience. He was more than an editor. He was a political kingmaker, a relentless crusader against the rampant corruption that greased the wheels of Mayor Robert Long Bob Williams' administration. A newsboy darted past, shouting headlines about the ongoing Wisconsin and Michigan forest fires. The smoke from those distant infernos had been drifting south for days, painting the Chicago sunsets a sickly, angry orange. It was a grim foreshadowing. "Mr. Medill, a word." Dennis Sweeney, the city's new fire marshal, approached. Sweeney was a stocky man with the powerful build of a laborer and the tired, worried eyes of a man who knew the calculus of disaster. He wore his uniform with a dignity that belied the pathetic state of his department. "Chief Sweeney," I nodded, a flicker of genuine respect replacing his usual editorial cynicism. "Your men are run ragged, I hear. Another blaze on the west side this morning?" "A stovepipe fire in a tenement. Nothing lost, but a little paint, thank God. But Medill, listen to me. The city is a powder keg. 3 weeks without a drop of rain. Every roof, every sidewalk, every plank of the river docks is dry as tinder. And the wind—" He paused, tilting his head skyward as a sudden sharp gust rattled a loose window pane nearby. "The wind is a demon. We had a major fire yesterday near the lumber district. The wind drove it so fast my men couldn't even keep up. We are outmanned, Medill. The engines are old, the horses are exhausted, and the hydrants leak like sieves because the aldermen don't see fit to fund proper maintenance." Medill's jaw tightened. "The city council continues to allocate a miserly budget to your department while lining their pockets with the proceeds from favorable lumber and land deals. I've written 6 editorials on the subject this month alone." "Editorials don't put water on a raging fire, Medill," Sweeney said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I have fewer than 185 men to protect a city of over 330,000 people. Most of our hose is rotten. If a major conflagration starts and the wind stays this high, we won't put it out. We'll only be able to watch it burn." Medill looked at the wooden buildings that crowded the streets, the wooden sidewalks, the wooden docks packed with pine and cedar. Chicago had been built on a marsh, and the cheapest way to build fast was to build with lumber. "I will print your warning, Chief," Medill promised. "Front page, a call to arms for every able-bodied man to be ready." Sweeney simply shook his head. "I have a feeling, Mr. Medill, that the warning is already too late." The air was still electric, the oppressive drought only worsening the suffocating feeling across the city. On the west side, nestled in the crowded, working-class neighborhood near DeKoven Street, the O'Leary family was settling in for the night. The legend, the enduring, comical, and utterly false legend, would forever claim that Mrs. Catherine O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in the family's small wooden barn. The reality was messier, less charming, and far more complex. a testament to the city's reckless construction and carelessness. Louis M. Cohn, a young, ambitious investigative journalist for the Tribune, was taking a late supper at a German saloon a few blocks from the O'Leary's property. Cohn, a protege of Medill, was hunting for a story on municipal corruption, specifically how Mayor Williams' cronies were allowing unregistered flammable materials to be stored near residential areas. He was interrupted by the smell, sharp and acrid, followed by the sound. The sound was not a siren. Chicago's fire bells were notoriously slow to ring. It was a sudden, violent hiss and crackle, like 1,000 dry leaves catching alight at once. Cohn bolted out of the saloon. He ran towards the glow. The O'Leary barn was already a raging torch. A whirlwind of flame was licking up the dry wooden fence and racing toward the neighboring shanties. The air temperature was already unbearable. The fire started at 8:30 p.m., though the official alarm wouldn't sound for another hour, a fatal delay caused by a drunken watchman and a broken telegraph alarm box. He saw it immediately, the terrible, compounding mistakes. The fire had started in one of the most densely packed, poorest parts of the city, a neighborhood entirely built of flammable materials. As he watched, a plume of fire leaped across an entire narrow street, driven by the merciless southwesterly wind. It wasn't a steady breeze, it was a gale, gusting violently, carrying burning shingles and embers across the rooftops. He found Chief Sweeney already on the scene, shouting desperately at his exhausted men. "Chief, where are the reinforcements?" Cohn yelled over the roar. Sweeney spat on the ground. The alarm was sent, but the signal officer, a political appointee with no business near the box, sent the engine companies to the wrong location. They're miles away. The flames were now towering, a monstrous red wave devouring block after block. The heat was so intense it was creating its own wind system, sucking more oxygen into the blaze. "We are losing it, Cohn," Sweeney said, his voice raw with fury and despair. "The lumber yard is next, then it crosses the river." Cohn stared at the clock tower of a nearby church, its bell silent, its wooden spire already outlined in the terrifying orange light. The wind was carrying brandons, burning pieces of wood, skyward, scattering them across the city like seeds of destruction. The official investigation would later prove that the delay and misdirection of the alarm systems was directly attributable to poor training and the political spoils system Medill had crusaded against for years. Cohn didn't wait. He turned and ran toward the city center, his only thought to get the true story, the terrifying, immediate reality, to the Tribune office before the flames swallowed the entire west side. He knew Medill would be waiting, ready to take up his post in the tower, a lighthouse against the coming storm. He had to write the headline that no one in Chicago wanted to read. "The city burns." The roar of the fire had become the city's new soundtrack. It was an oceanic sound, a combination of the wind, the collapsing structures, and the shrieks of the hundreds of thousands of people now realizing the danger. Joseph Medill stood in his office, his face illuminated by the flickering gaslight and the infernal glow bleeding in through the window. He was a general in his war room. His printers, compositors, and editorial staff were huddled together, some packing valuables, others standing frozen in horror. "Gentlemen, are you afraid of a little smoke?" Medill's voice was sharp, cutting through the panic. "The Tribune will not fall silent. This fire will be the biggest story of our lifetime, and we will document it, word by word, until the flames are at our door." He ordered the presses to run, churning out an extra edition with Sweeney's original warning, now a haunting prophecy. Cohn burst through the door, his clothes reeking of smoke and his face smudged with soot. He immediately began scrawling notes on a pad, his hand shaking. Medill, it's beyond control. The wind is an engine. The fire is jumping whole blocks at a time. It's reached the South Division. It's going to jump the river. Medill grabbed a map of the city, unfurling it on his desk. Where are the fire companies concentrating? Sweeney tried to make a stand at the West Division bridges, but the heat is too great. The Brandons are raining down. They're already across the south branch of the river. They've hit the lumber docks near Adams Street. That wood is all pine, Medill. It will burn like oil. Medill slammed his fist on the map, pointing toward the core of the city. The financial district, the post office, City Hall. The fire was moving relentlessly toward the heart of the city, the place where all the records, the land deeds, the bank ledgers, the political documents that might finally expose William's corruption were stored. "We need to warn the north side," Medill exclaimed. The fire was moving northeast, pushed by the gale, but the river offered a momentary defense. "The river is nothing, sir. The heat is so intense it is creating fire whirls, small tornadoes of flame. They are lifting burning debris and hurling it over the water. They don't need a bridge. They're flying over." Medill looked out the window. The sky was no longer just red. It was a boiling, turbulent orange. Burning pieces of wood and paper drifted past the glass like grotesque snowflakes. "We must save the press plates," Medill declared, rallying his men. "If we lose the press, we lose our voice. We will take the critical plates and type to the basement. We will cover the printing machines with wet canvas. The building is stone, solid granite. It must hold." Medill, the editor, had transformed into the commander. He was fighting the fire with stubborn defiance and an absolute refusal to be silenced. He knew the paper's very existence and its truth-telling mission was about to be put to the ultimate test. He looked at Cohn. "Write the story, boy. Write the truth. Tell them it wasn't a cow. Tell them it was corruption, cheap wood, and the devil's wind that burned this city down. We will print until the presses melt beneath the heat." The clock tower above their heads began to emit a hideous sound, not the clang of a bell, but the groaning and splintering of dry wood catching fire. The flames had reached the roof. The stone structure of the Tribune building was surrounded, a tiny island of defiance in a sea of fire. The Tribune building, Medill's fortress, was about to be consumed, but its granite walls, a symbol of his unwavering commitment to his vision, would ultimately play a role in the city's astonishing rebirth. The city was dissolving into ash and terror, but Medill was focused on only one thing: the story. He would survive, and he would ensure that the truth of Chicago's fiery destruction and the spectacular, ambitious saga of its rebuilding would be the first words printed on the morning after. The fire had achieved the critical mass of a firestorm. It was no longer a fire. It was a weather system, drawing in air at gale-force speeds and spitting out flaming debris miles away. The city's famous iron and stone structures, meant to symbolize permanence, were beginning to fail catastrophically. Joseph Medill and his staff had done their work. The presses were secured, critical type cases covered with wet canvas, and the basement door locked. Now they were refugees. Medill stood across the street, watching his granite fortress, the Tribune building, buckle under the immense heat. The massive clock tower, which had held the city's time, became a silhouette against the hellish glow, then collapsed inward with a grinding roar that shook the earth. "She's gone, sir," whispered Augustus Schermerhorn, the senior compositor, his face streaked with tears and soot. Medill removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The building is gone, Gus. The Tribune is not. Remember that. We lost granite, not principle." A desperate, terrified stream of humanity flowed past them, the wealthy in carriages piled high with furniture, the poor clutching small sacks of irreplaceable possessions. The air was filled with a rain of cinders and embers, tiny terrifying missiles that ignited everything they touched. Medill spotted a familiar, desperate figure pushing through the crowd. Chief Dennis Sweeney. He looked utterly defeated. His uniform was torn, his face blistered, and he carried no helmet. "Sweeney, report," Medill shouted, pulling the chief aside. "It's a massacre, Medill. We're beaten. The heat is melting our hoses. We tried to make a stand on the bridge at Randolph Street. The wood structure was so dry it exploded. My men couldn't even get close enough to pump water." He pointed north. "It's crossed the main river branch. It's in the North Division now. Every opulent mansion, every overcrowded tenement, every lumberyard, they're all going. There's no stopping it now. We're reduced to saving people, not property." The North Division was home to the waterworks, the massive pumping station that supplied all the city's water. Medill's eyes widened. "The waterworks? Chief, if that station goes, we lose the pressure to fight anything. You have to save it. It's the last hope." Sweeney shook his head, a gesture of absolute exhaustion. "I took my best remaining company there 2 hours ago. But the wind, Medill, the wind, it's blowing sparks from the Michigan docks. That building is granite, yes, but the roof is tinder. If the fire hits the coal supply, it's over." Suddenly, the night sky was split by a different sound, a massive explosion. It wasn't the sound of collapsing wood, but a sharp, violent detonation. A low, terrified murmur went through the crowd. "There goes the city council's dirty laundry," Medill said darkly, "and with it every official record we need to rebuild correctly. This isn't just a fire, Sweeney, it's an erasure." As the chief turned to rally his few remaining men to the north side, Medill made a decision. He had to save the truth. He needed to find a way to communicate, even if the city was reduced to ash. "Cone!" he yelled, spotting his young reporter, Lewis Cone, stumbling toward them, still clutching his notepad. "Get to the lakefront. Find the nearest telegraph office that is outside the fire zone. Telegraph our sister paper in Milwaukee. Tell them to send a team and a press and to hold space on their front page for the Tribune's report on the destruction of the Western metropolis." Cone stared into the inferno. "The telegraph lines are down across the entire city, sir. Then you run, find a boat, take a horse. I don't care if you have to walk to Kenosha, but you will get the truth out. Go!" Cone didn't hesitate. He turned his back on the flames and began to run east toward Lake Michigan, disappearing into the chaotic, smoke-filled night. Medill watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the burning ruin of his life's work. He knew the fight had just begun. The task now was survival and the preparation for the inevitable rebirth. The fire had been burning for nearly 12 hours. The wind had not relented. It was no longer a southwesterly gale, but a roaring engine that screamed over the desolate ruins of the downtown, driving the blaze toward Lake Michigan. Chief Dennis Sweeney and his exhausted crew, barely 40 men remaining, reached the vicinity of the Chicago Waterworks pumping station. The station was a low, heavy building of yellow Joliet stone, but it was now entirely surrounded by fire. The heat was so intense, it felt like standing directly in front of a blast furnace. Sweeney shielded his face, his eyes red and tearing. "Chief, we can't get close," yelled Captain Finnegan, pointing to the iron fence surrounding the station grounds. The paint on the fence was blistering. "If the pumps fail, it's not just the north side that's lost. It's the entire population without potable water. Cholera will finish what the fire starts." He saw the problem immediately. Firebrands, carried high on the gale, were raining down on the coal pile used to fuel the massive steam pumps. The bituminous coal was smoking, and small flames were starting to lick at the edges. "We have to soak the coal, now," Sweeney ordered. But they couldn't get the hose line close enough. The hoses they did have were either rotten or had been cut by falling debris.
The pressure was already dropping as the wooden water mains outside the fire zone began to char and collapse. Sweeney made a desperate decision. He ordered his men to abandon the hoses and find axes and shovels. "We can't fight the fire, but we can fight the fuel." He led his men in a frantic, suicidal effort to dig a line of separation around the burning coal pile, using wet blankets and salvaged boards to protect themselves from the intense radiation. They worked shoulder to shoulder, their breath ragged, coughing up black soot with every gasp. The stones of the pumping station walls were cracking. Just as they finished carving a narrow, scorched line of dirt between the main coal stock and the engine room wall, a tremendous tongue of flame leapt from the burning stable next door and slammed against the side of the stone structure. Inside the station, the steam engineer, a man named William E. Brown, was frantically battling small fires and keeping the giant pumps running. But the fire's heat was cracking the windows, and the coal he needed was smoldering uncontrollably just outside. Then, disaster. A massive, burning timber beam from a collapsing bridge was carried by the wind and smashed directly into the inlet crib pipe, the main artery drawing water from the lake. The pipe shattered. The deep, powerful thump-thump-thump of the pumping engines began to falter. The gauges plummeted to zero. The pumps gasped, shuddered, and stopped. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than the roar of the flames. Sweeney sank to his knees outside the wall, exhausted, defeated. He had fought with every ounce of his energy and had lost. Without water pressure, the city was dead. The fire could burn until it reached the lake or until it ran out of fuel. Looking up, he saw the ultimate insult. The fire, finding no more fuel to the south, was now consuming the wealthy Gold Coast mansions to the north and east, driving people onto the piers. The wind had become a pyre, and Sweeney, the city's protector, could only watch it burn.
The dawn was not gray. It was a hideous, shimmering blood red. The fire, having devoured 4 square miles of the city, was finally starting to burn itself out near the lakefront, having run out of dry lumber to consume. Louis Cone lay sprawled on the beach, his chest heaving, his body covered in a thick layer of fine black ash. He had run nearly 5 miles, skirting the advancing flames, dodging looters, and leaping over fallen telegraph poles. He had failed. Every telegraph line he had found was snapped, charred, or completely gone. There was no way to signal Milwaukee. He struggled to his feet, turning back toward the ruins. The entire horizon was a smoking, desolate flatland, punctuated by the skeletal ruins of iron safes and chimneys. Chicago monuments, as they would soon be called. Cone's journalistic instinct, however, was stronger than his exhaustion. He wasn't just running, he was observing. He pulled out his soaked notepad and began to scribble, even as the smoke burned his lungs. The terror of the wealthy was equal to the poor. Saw Governor Oglesby helping clear debris. Saw Mayor Williams, the man whose corruption fueled this disaster, fleeing in a state of shock, utterly useless. The great irony. The fire spared nothing built of wood, but it saved the Rookery building because it was mostly iron and stone. It is a lesson in architecture written in the hottest fire imaginable. Cone looked at his surroundings. Thousands of survivors were huddled on the lakefront, shivering, hungry, and in shock. The great city, the arrogant, booming western hub, was a smoking wound. Then he saw it. A small, sturdy tugboat, listing slightly, pulling up to the shoreline well outside the restricted military zone. On the deck, a man in a rumpled suit and a dust-covered hat was staring at the destruction through a spyglass. It was Horace Greeley, an editor from New York, who had sailed in from the north, drawn by the incredible spectacle. Cone ran, scrambling over the rocky beach, splashing into the cold lake water.
Sir, are you a reporter?" Cohn yelled. The man lowered his spyglass, regarding the soot-covered youth. "I am Horace Greeley, and judging by your attire, you are the last surviving member of the Chicago Press. I am Louis Cohn, Chicago Tribune. My editor, Joseph Medill, ordered me to get the truth out. The city is gone. The press is gone. We need a way to print. We need a voice before the military declares martial law and the rumors start." Greeley's eyes shone with the predatory gleam of a true newsman. "The biggest story of the century, boy. I'll give you passage to Milwaukee. You'll write your account on my boat, and we'll charter a press there." Cohn stared at the ruins of Chicago, then back at the boat. He didn't just have to report the destruction, he had to launch the campaign for the city's reconstruction. He had to carry Medill's defiance on the waves. "I have 2 conditions, sir," Cohn said, climbing aboard. "First, my story runs exactly as written. And second, you must print Medill's opening declaration in full. The fire was not an act of God, it was a failure of city government and a testament to corrupt, shoddy construction. We must demand a city built of brick and stone, not wood and lies." Greeley extended a hand, a grim smile on his face. "You have a true editor's heart, Cohn. Tell me everything. The world is waiting to hear how the western metropolis burned to the ground." As the tugboat pulled away from the devastated shore, Cohn pulled out his last clean sheet of paper. The first task was over, the survival. The second, more immense task was just beginning. The documentation of the loss and the blueprint for the Phoenix City that would rise from the ashes. Medill's plan was to turn the fire itself into a political weapon to force a new era of reform.
The Milwaukee Sentinel press room was a cavern of steam, oil, and frantic energy. The presses, however, were not running the usual Milwaukee news. They were running the Chicago Tribune in exile. Louis Cohn, having made the arduous journey north via the chartered tugboat, stood beside the roaring press, his face exhausted but triumphant. He held a copy of the extra edition, printed on foreign presses, yet bearing the proud, defiant masthead of the Chicago Tribune. The headline was not a whimper, it was a battle cry. "Cheer up, Chicago shall rise again." Below the headline, the lead editorial, written by Cohn but carrying the undeniable, thundering voice of Joseph Medill, was a stunning fusion of grief, prophecy, and political indictment. "The western metropolis is gone. 4 square miles reduced to cinders. Loss estimated at $200 million. But the fire was not an act of God. It was a failure of men. It was the result of a city built on shoddy construction and political graft. We were choked by wood and incompetence, and we have paid the price in ash." Cohn watched as the bundled papers were rushed to the docks, destined to be loaded onto the first southbound trains and steamers. This was Medill's defiance. The city had burned, but its conscience would not be silenced. Inside the small, temporary office assigned to him, Cohn was interrupted by a Western Union telegram delivered by a frantic messenger. It was from Medill, now holed up in a temporary headquarters in the still-standing South Side, already plotting the next move. The message was brief and direct. "Cohn, return, immediately. No more cow. We are done with the cow. Find me Denny Sweeney. New plan, architecture and law. Medill." The cow reference was Medill's furious rejection of the absurd but viral rumor that Mrs. O'Leary's cow was to blame. Medill knew that scapegoat story would allow the true culprits, the corrupt alderman who permitted the wooden tinderbox construction, to escape justice. The new plan was clear. Medill would not merely report the rebuild, he would run it. He would use the power of the press and the moral shock of the fire to seize control of the shattered city government. The editor was about to become the reformer, and perhaps the mayor. The North Division was a wasteland. The air, though no longer burning, was thick with the foul smell of wet ash, scorched timber, and lingering coal smoke. A light, cold rain had begun to fall, turning the 4-square-mile debris field into a greasy black mire. Chief Denny Sweeney stood on what used to be his front porch. His home was reduced to a few broken chimney bricks and a twisted cast-iron stove. He found the melted remnants of a locket his wife Martha had given him. He knelt, picking up the useless metal, his massive frame shaking not from cold, but from sheer emotional exhaustion. He had lost his home, his city, and many of his men. The final, terrible count of the Chicago Fire Department was a testament to their valor. 19 men killed, and almost all equipment destroyed. A soldier, now patrolling under the declaration of martial law by General Sheridan, approached him. "Chief Sweeney, a man named Medell is looking for you. They've commandeered a dry goods store on the south side." Sweeney stood up, brushing the soot from his trousers. He felt hollow. His mission had been to protect the city, and he had failed. He arrived at the temporary Tribune office, a chaotic but organized center of activity. Medell, despite his losses, was barking orders, already organizing a massive relief effort while simultaneously planning the new municipal code. "Chief, thank God you're here," Medell greeted him, his handshake firm. "The city needs you now more than ever. You are the only man left with the moral authority to speak on infrastructure." "I'm failed. We lost the waterworks, we lost the North Division, we lost everything because the pipes were rotten and the alarm boxes were a farce." "Precisely," Medell said, slamming a piece of paper onto a makeshift desk. "And you are the only one who can fix it. I'm running for mayor. The aldermen are hiding under rocks. The public needs a leader, and they need a plan." Medell laid out his radical proposal, the Union Fireproof Ticket, a coalition of reformers dedicated to rebuilding Chicago, not just bigger, but better. "I need you to chair the Fire Department Reorganization Committee. I need your absolute honesty, Chief. I need you to demand nonpartisan professional appointments for every single position, from the alarm box watchman to the chief engineer. I want you to design a system where a fire can never again defeat a city this way." Sweeney looked at the chaos outside, the hundreds of homeless, the soldiers with fixed bayonets, the smoldering ruins. The task was monumental. "I have one condition, Medell," Sweeney said, his voice regaining its command. "No more volunteers, no more political appointments. I need professional, paid firemen with new steam-powered engines and the authority to tear down any building in the path of a fire, no matter who owns it." Medell nodded, his agreement absolute. "Done. And a non-negotiable fire limit ordinance. No new construction in the burned district will be permitted unless it is brick, stone, or iron. I want to build a firewall against the next disaster. The Tribune will fund the drafting of the new codes itself." Sweeney finally smiled, a grim, exhausted expression. The city had died, but the core of its fighting spirit was being reforged in the heat of political necessity. He now had a mission that transcended putting out fires. He had to design the unburnable city.
The recovery effort began with a furious, almost unbelievable speed, a testament to the aggressive, risk-taking nature of Chicago's citizens. They didn't wait for federal aid, which was slow to arrive. They simply started clearing the debris themselves. Louis Cohn had returned and was now Medell's shadow, a roving correspondent documenting not the destruction, but the resurrection. His dispatches, smuggled south for printing and rushed back north, became the city's daily devotional. Cohn was assigned to the emerging community of architects and engineers. They met in tents, temporary sheds, and the surviving saloons, sketching blueprints on salvaged packing crates. He met William LeBaron Jenney, a talented engineer who had been a Union major in the Civil War. Jenney was proposing something utterly radical, a steel-framed skeleton for buildings. "It's the only answer, Mr. Cohn," Jenney explained, sketching furiously. "Stone and brick are heavy. They rely on massive, thick walls for support. When the fire hits, those heavy walls collapse. But an internal skeleton of iron, clad in fireproof terracotta and masonry, transfers the weight and defies the flame." Cohn realized the profound symbolic weight of this idea. Chicago was literally reinventing modern construction. The destruction of its old wooden past was making way for the world's first truly modern city, the birthplace of the skyscraper. Meanwhile, Medill's political campaign was a whirlwind. Running on the fireproof ticket, he leveraged the Tribune's relentless coverage of the corruption that led to the fire. His campaign rallies were simply editorial readings. He didn't need to promise hope. He needed to demand justice. The incumbent, Long Bob Williams, was a ghost, unable to defend his wooden city and his missing accounts. On November 7, 1871, less than a month after the Great Fire, Joseph Medill was elected the 26th mayor of Chicago in a landslide. His inaugural action to ratify Sweeney's demands, including the immediate implementation of the Fire Limits Ordinance, a permanent, non-negotiable law that forbade the construction of wooden buildings in the center of the city. This was the true historical miracle of Chicago. Where other cities like London or Boston had taken years to recover, Chicago began rebuilding immediately, forced by Medill and Sweeney to use only the most modern, fire-resistant materials. The ashes became the fertile ground for innovation. The fight, however, was not over. Medill's draconian policies, his enforcement of the new building codes, his crackdown on crime, and his controversial blue laws, banning certain activities on Sundays to maintain order, quickly earned him powerful enemies among the working class and the wealthy developers who preferred cheap construction. As mayor, Medill was no longer just the conscience of the city, he was its dictator. The very spirit of defiance that had propelled him to power now threatened to tear the rebuilt city apart. The phoenix had risen, but its wings were already clipped by political dissent. The coming years of Medill's mayoralty would prove to be as intense and challenging as the fire itself. Mayor Joseph Medill was not built for compromise. The fire had stripped away his journalistic impartiality, replacing it with the zeal of a crusader. He governed the ruins of Chicago with a righteous fury, viewing his term not as a political office, but as a moral receivership. His primary weapon was the Fire Limits Ordinance, now known colloquially as the Brick and Stone Law. Every square foot of the burned district was restricted to non-combustible construction. This immediately created a war between the old guard of cheap, fast lumber barons and the new wave of architects and insurance interests demanding permanence. Medill used his emergency powers, granted in the wake of the disaster, to enforce the law with military precision. "Tear it down!" Medill roared one spring morning, standing ankle-deep in mud and melted glass at the edge of the burned district. He pointed a cane at a frame shack that had sprung up overnight, a temporary carpenter's office. Louis Cohn, now Medill's primary aide, rushed forward. "Mayor, the owner says it's temporary. He needs it to coordinate his legitimate brick projects across the street." "Temporary leads to permanent, and wood leads to ruin. The moment a wooden nail is driven into that structure, it is a risk to a half-mile radius," Medill spat. "If the law is a firewall, then that shack is a crack in the mortar. Chief Sweeney, get your men to it." Chief Dennis Sweeney, freshly funded and formally reorganized, arrived with a demolition crew. Sweeney was Medill's indispensable arm, disciplined, honest, and utterly loyal to the idea of a safer city. Under his command, the fire department was being professionalized, the first new steam fire engines ordered, and the fire alarm telegraph system completely overhauled and insulated. The shacks came down. The site was popular with the wealthy, who saw their investments protected. But to the working-class families and German and Irish immigrants living on the city's periphery, who could only afford to build wood-frame cottages, the act was tyranny. Medill's law made their housing impossibly expensive, trapping them in overcrowded, distant tenements. The resentment came to a head over Medill's other great moral crusade, the Blue Laws. Determined to sanitize Chicago, Medill ordered the strict enforcement of an old ordinance prohibiting drinking, gambling, and dancing on Sundays. This was a direct attack on the core of immigrant social life, the German beer halls and Irish taverns. One Sunday evening, Medill received a frantic message. A large crowd, mostly German laborers, had gathered outside the temporary city hall, chanting for his resignation. They were led by a powerful alderman from the West Side who had lost a fortune in Medill's construction crackdown. Medill walked out alone to face the mob. "Mayor Medill," yelled a man in the front, holding a sign. "Give us beer or give us death." Medill held up his hand. "The fire was fought by water, not whiskey. You accuse me of oppression, yet your own careless construction and your lazy politics gave us this ashes and shame. You want beer? I demand brick. You demand merriment? I demand morality. The cost of this city's rebirth is order, temperance, and permanence." His rhetoric, effective in the pages of the Tribune, fell flat against the emotional, drunken rage of the crowd. They jeered and hurled chunks of coal. Cohn rushed to pull the mayor back inside. Medill had won the election, but he was losing the people. He had saved the architecture, but he was losing the soul of the city. While Medill fought a brutal political and moral war, the actual rebuilding proceeded at a staggering pace. Architects and builders, forced by the brick and stone law, began a dizzying period of structural innovation. Louis Cohn spent less time at City Hall and more time on the construction sites, acting as the Tribune's chronicler of the new Chicago. He watched the erection of the first true iron-skeletoned buildings. He shadowed William LeBaron Jenney, who had secured the commission for a large office block. Jenney wasn't building with bricks supporting the walls. He was building with a frame of iron columns and beams, with masonry merely hanging like cladding. Cohn stood next to Jenney, looking up at the skeletal frame, 5 stories high and climbing. "Major Jenney, you call this a breakthrough, but the critics say the fire proved iron fails. It warps and buckles in the heat." Jenney wiped sweat from his brow. "They are right about unprotected iron, Mr. Cohn. The fire twisted the old iron front stores into ribbons. But this is different. We are encasing every single iron column in terracotta tile and fireproofed plaster. We are learning how to isolate the skeleton from the flame." This innovation was revolutionary. It meant walls could be thinner, foundations smaller, and buildings could rise higher than ever thought possible on Chicago's soft clay soil. The need for fireproof construction, Medill's stubborn law, and Jenney's engineering genius were together creating the architectural concept that would become the skyscraper. Cohn wrote about it with zeal. "The iron frame is the bone, the fireproof casing is the skin, and the Chicago spirit is the animating force." He was documenting the birth of the Chicago School of Architecture. But this innovation was tremendously expensive, demanding capital and credit. Just as the city reached its peak of furious rebuilding, a dark cloud gathered on the distant financial horizon. The boom years following the Civil War, fueled by reckless railroad speculation, had finally ended. In September 1873, the banking firm of J. Cook & Company, heavily invested in Northern Pacific Railroad bonds, collapsed. The news flashed across the continent, triggering the panic of 1873. The financial crisis hit Chicago with devastating speed. The frantic pace of rebuilding came to a grinding halt. Credit dried up, banks failed. Construction loans were revoked overnight, leaving dozens of half-finished skeletal iron frames standing against the skyline, monuments to a suddenly vanished prosperity. Medill, the strong-willed mayor, now faced an enemy he could not veto, arrest, or tear down: economic depression. The widespread unemployment caused by the panic exacerbated the deep social resentment against him. His fire limits law, which had protected the city's future, was now seen as the cause of the economic calamity by the common worker, who was left homeless and jobless. The Tribune, under Medill's direction, launched a furious campaign, trying to rally the city with the same cheer-up optimism as before, but the words rang hollow. In City Hall, the political backlash was overwhelming. The aldermen, seeing Medill weakened by the financial collapse and popular hatred over the Blue Laws, began to resist his every move. They rejected his budget reforms and successfully repealed some of his Sunday ordinances. Medill, the ultimate control seeker, found himself losing control on every front. The relentless stress, the fire, the mayoralty, the continuous political warfare, and now the economic collapse had finally broken his health. In late September 1873, after less than 2 years in office, Joseph Medill made a profound decision. He called Cohn into his office. "Cohn, the phoenix needs to fly, but I cannot be the cage any longer," Medill said, signing a document. "I have laid the groundwork. The fire limits are law. Sweeney's department is professionalized. The architects have the blueprint, but the city hates me." The paper he signed was his resignation. "The only thing I can still save is my health and the Tribune. I am transferring all control of the paper to my partner, Horace White, and I am leaving for Europe. I need to recover, and Chicago needs a fresh start. You will remain here, Cohn. You are my eyes. You will ensure the builders don't compromise and the politicians don't forget the fire." Medill, the journalist who became a dictator, was now an exile. He stepped down, leaving the city in the hands of an acting mayor and the chaos of a national depression. His 2 years had been a brutal, visionary success, forging the rules for the new Chicago. The final act of Chicago's rebirth would belong to the men left behind, to Cohn, the reporter who became a watchdog, and to Sweeney, the chief who became the architect of safety, who together had to navigate the city through the 5 years of depression and doubt that lay ahead, ensuring that the dream of the Phoenix City did not die in the shadow of the Panic of 1873.
The Panic of 1873 had crippled Chicago's economy, but it had not touched its worst vulnerability. The vast, wooden-built neighborhoods, south and west of the Loop, that lay outside Mayor Medill's original 1872 brick and stone fire limits. The business district was fireproof. The working-class homes were not. On a blisteringly hot afternoon in mid-July 1874, the ghost of the Great Fire returned. Louis Cohn, the mayor's former aide who had returned to the Tribune as a special correspondent, was in the newsroom when the alarm struck. It was a familiar dread, a high-pitched, insistent clang from the courthouse tower. "Cohn, what district?" yelled the editor. Cohn ran to the telegraph operator. "It's the southwest side, near 12th Street, the Cheyenne district." The air itself seemed to remember the fire of 1871. Dry conditions, 90-degree heat, and a powerful southwest wind, the exact factors that had driven the first conflagration. Chief Dennis Sweeney was already a blur. Having survived the political infighting that ousted Medill, he was now in a position of complete command over the city's reorganized fire department.
He rushed toward the blaze, his heart heavy with the grim knowledge that a fully professional, steam-powered department would not matter if the construction was kindling. The fire began, reports said, in a small wooden shanty next to an oil works near Clark Street. Fueled by oil barrels and driven by the gale, the fire raced northeast through a dense area of wooden frame homes, tenements, and churches that had existed before the 1871 fire and had been excluded from Medill's strictest codes. As Cohn raced to the scene, the smoke blotted out the sun. This time, there was no O'Leary Tau, no single scapegoat. This was merely the inevitable consequence of a city half built on compromise. The Chicago Fire of 1874, or the Little Fire, raged for over 8 hours, consuming 812 buildings and about 47 acres of land. It was a disaster on a smaller scale than the 1871 catastrophe, but its location, a working-class neighborhood of Polish, Russian Jewish, and African-American immigrants, made it a potent political statement. The flames devoured homes, synagogues, and churches. However, when the fire reached the southern edge of the 1871 burn district, it stopped. The newly constructed, brick and stone, iron skeleton buildings of the rebuilding effort held the line. Medill's stubborn, dictatorial law had worked. The fire had been contained by architecture, not just firefighting. The 1874 fire was the final, undeniable lesson Chicago needed. The economic logic of allowing cheap, fast wooden construction had been utterly refuted. The aftermath of the fire was swift and politically uncompromising. The city's insurance underwriters, backed by the Citizens Association, issued an ultimatum: extend the fire limits to the entire city, or we will cease doing business here. The Common Council, no longer able to resist, bowed to the ultimate authority of capital and catastrophe. Cohn wrote the Tribune editorial that summarized the new decree. The second fire has burned away the last vestiges of doubt and compromise. What Mayor Medill could not compel with the force of his office, the flames have now secured with the force of destruction. The fire limits are now the city limits. From this day forward, no wood frame building may be erected anywhere in Chicago. The rule of the Phoenix must be the rule of every house. The new ordinance, passed immediately, extended the permanent ban on wood frame buildings to cover virtually the entire city of Chicago. It was the true, final, and enduring legacy of Joseph Medill's short, controversial term, solidified by a second tragedy. Chief Sweeney's triumph was equally absolute. His department's performance, though unable to stop the fire's initial spread through the tinderbox district, had proved the worth of his professional reforms and his new equipment. The department was fully empowered and given the resources to install an extensive new water supply system and an expanded network of hydrants, a system now backed by iron and stone, not just political will. With the political, moral, and architectural rules of the new city now set in uncompromising stone, the economic depression became the only remaining obstacle. The Panic of 1873 would drag on for 5 long years, but the rebuilding of Chicago, fueled by the massive insurance payouts and the ironclad conviction of a disaster-proof future, could not be stopped. The architects, led by Jenny and the rising stars of the Chicago School, pushed the new building codes to their limits. Cohn stood on the foundation of a commercial building, watching a crew assembling a steel and terracotta skeleton that would rise 8 stories, a colossal height for the time. He spoke with Dankmar Adler, a pioneering architect and engineer. "Mr. Adler, the entire building seems to be a cage of metal. The exterior walls are simply hanging from the frame. We are building the tallest structures in the world on a bed of mud." Adler, leaning on a survey tripod, smiled. Mr. Cohn, the great lesson of the fire was that masonry failed, but metal survived if properly protected. We are not building walls to hold up the ceiling. We are building a frame, protecting it with fire clay and hanging the stone skin upon it. We have conquered the fire, and in doing so, we have conquered the need for thickness and bulk. He pointed to the sky. The old city was built horizontally, a testament to the wooden frontier. The new Chicago must be built vertically, a testament to American engineering. The need for compact, dense commercial space, combined with the new law of fireproof construction, has created the only possible solution: the steel skeleton skyscraper. The Depression slowed the pace, but it could not kill the idea. The construction that followed the second fire was not just a replacement of the old, but a radical, global architectural revolution. Joseph Medill, returning from Europe in 1874, did not return to the mayor's office. He bought a controlling interest in the Tribune, taking back the editor's chair, and his influence became once again the moral compass of the city. He saw his legacy everywhere, a city rising, taller, cleaner, and safer than he had left it. By the end of the decade, Chicago had not only recovered, but surpassed its former glory. It had faced an unprecedented disaster, endured a political dictatorship, survived a second fire, and navigated a brutal depression. From a vast horizontal lumberyard, it had been reborn as the vertical city, a laboratory of architectural innovation, disciplined by the law, and ruled by the relentless memory of the flames.